All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this monthly Charging Smart webinar. Today, we will be talking about regulations and zoning considerations that might impact your transportation electrification work. Next slide, please. We will get started with an icebreaker in just a moment, and then we'll go over an overview of Charging Smart's regulation category and some of the required actions that it includes for each level of designation. Then I'll hand it over to for our primary content today, I'll hand it over to our guest speaker, Ed Gilliland, who is a senior director at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, or IREC, which is the prime leader on the Charging Smart program at the national level, to share his expertise on these topics, which is going to be a really valuable set of knowledge to help implement some of these Charging Smart requirements. After that, we will have some time for you to ask questions and get some answers to your needs, and we'll wrap up with a few important reminders. So with that, let's move on to our icebreaker. First, I will ask that if you are able to, on your Zoom name, please change that to include what city and state you're representing. We do have folks joining us from a couple of different states today, which is exciting. And then go ahead and open your chat and introduce yourself, including your name and city, and answer the following two questions. The first one is about today's topic and asks, does your community currently have regulations for charging infrastructure in your zoning code? And the second one is just for a bit of fun, given the holiday today. What is your favorite Halloween candy? I will, for the sake of completeness, introduce myself verbally here as well. I'm Mackenzie Love, the Senior Program Manager and Transportation Planner at the Great Plains Institute, or GPI. I lead our work on Charging Smart, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be here with you today. I don't think I have a favorite Halloween candy because this is my favorite holiday, but I am very much looking forward to hopefully giving these new green candy bars out to trick-or-treaters this evening. So I do see some folks responding here in the chat. We have a couple of cities that have EVSE regulations that they added earlier this year in Falcon Heights. It's great to hear hear a reminder of. And other folks who are making lots of development beginning in the last year or so. I'm also seeing a lot of passionate responses about the favorite candies. So I'm hoping that we can keep, I know it's hard to compete with Reese's peanut butter cups apparently, but we will try to keep that passion going throughout our next slides as we start talking about regulations. So let's give that a whirl. Perfect, thank you, Muntas. So what are we talking about in terms of regulation? In the Charging Smart program, the regulation category looks at the legal frameworks, policies, and procedures that guide or enable the integration of electric charging infrastructure into your community. So it covers topics like your zoning code, which I've already alluded to, but also construction standards. Sometimes it touches building codes, infrastructure development guidelines, particularly around accessibility for ADA requirements and other relevant national guidelines. And as you're moving through all of those, the Charging Smart program does encourage you to look at removing barriers to deployment through those regulatory processes and policies. Mainly that's done through the EVs for all aspect of Charging Smart, which I'll touch on in just a little bit as well. Next slide, please. I'm seeing more about code updates. This is exciting. So within the Charging Smart program, there are requirements in the regulation category at each level of designation, bronze, silver, and gold. So we'll start by walking through a couple of those. And I wanted to break them down because the regulation category can be the most complex. So we wanted to make sure it's easily understandable and digestible. And before I get started on bronze, I just wanted to highlight again, if you have any questions or ideas, or concerns about the regulation category, please reach out to the GPI team at any point, call us or email us, because we'd be happy to help walk you through anything or think through these complex topics. I'll also note that some of the regulation category criteria, like the ones you see on your screen, do have longer lead times. We did cover this in a critical early actions webinar in July. So I'll go ahead and drop the link to that recording in the chat in just a few minutes. You can refer back to it as well. And we will walk through them, a couple of them again right now, as they are required at the various levels of designation. So jumping right into the bronze level of designation, there are three required criteria in the regulation category. I won't go into all of them in a great deal of detail, but I want to highlight a few things. So let's start with R1.5, which is to review the zoning requirements and identify restrictions that intentionally or unintentionally prohibit electric vehicle charger deployment and compile those findings in a memo. So this memo can be really useful for you as a community representative to understand any barriers that you're probably already aware of, but that might be highlighted in a new way by consolidating all of the information in one place. And it helps identify opportunities for maybe some of those easy wins or low-hanging fruit that you can get rolling with and really help start your journey into electrification. So it's useful to understand both barriers and opportunities. It also helps us as your technical assistance provider to understand your context and what situation you're facing in terms of regulation, so we can best advise on lessons learned that we found from other communities we've engaged, or guidance from the Charging Smart Resource Library, which is quite extensive, to make sure that it matches exactly what you're experiencing. And if we don't have one, so that we can work to help develop something to be of assistance. The final thing I'll say here is that this kind of memo can also help inform any sort of policy making discussions that you need to have with your elected leaders or local officials, or perhaps the development of any funding application. So this memo can be a really great first step in getting the lay of the land and organizing everything to move forward with other actions. One more thing I wanted to say here is that it does include this concept of restrictions that are unintentional, which is a little bit nebulous and can be difficult to think through. So I want to highlight a couple of examples here. When EV charging was first coming onto the scene, a lot of folks integrated it into zoning by considering it the same as a motor vehicle fueling station in terms of zoning requirements, which can create some which can trigger some environmental policy considerations that might not be necessary around an electric vehicle charger in the same way that is necessary around a fuel depot. So that could be something that was not intentionally placed as a barrier, but effectively creates some difficulties. There are some other examples, but if you're not sure where to go with understanding any potential unintended impacts, the GPI team is, of course, happy to help walk through that as well. So the other two required criteria in regulations at the bronze level are to adopt a standard EV charging permit process and post it publicly, and develop a charging infrastructure permitting checklist and post that online so that folks working on projects have that clear set of expectations as they get going on projects, which can hopefully make them move faster. Now, if we move on to the silver level of designation, there are two additional criteria that are required here. So you need to complete the three that I just mentioned, and work on permitting chargers as an accessory use in all parking lots and zoning districts by right. And I think we might cover that a bit more later, so I'll leave it there. And allow charging infrastructure stalls to count towards parking minimums if you have those in your zoning code. If you don't have parking minimums in your zoning code, that's perfectly fine. We just ask you to achieve an additional 10 points, general points in the regulation category of your choosing. We just want to make sure if you have parking minimums, they're being addressed, and if not, you can certainly choose an alternative action. With that, we'll move on to gold, please. And there are two further requirements, required criteria in this category. The first is, establishing standard approval timelines for charger installation, and trying to think through the process that you have around receiving and addressing comments with the vendor or the operator for those charger stations, and trying to consolidate those so that folks have the feedback that they need all in one time, maybe from multiple departments can be consolidated into one instance of feedback to that vendor or installer, so that you're kind of keeping the overall approval process concise and able to and nimble in a way that it can keep rolling. And if that's not applicable, you can also seek an alternative action from the framework, and GPI would be happy to help you think through what that could look like if desired. The final requirement at Gold is to adopt a technology-neutral EV-ready ordinance and plan for new construction that is consistent with established national standards. So here we're looking for ordinances that don't specify which technologies are necessary for a installer to consider, and instead allow them to have the flexibility to meet the specific needs of their use case. And this helps reduce the cost by allowing infrastructure that is capable of adapting over time to new technology needs as they evolve. I think one more slide from me will talk about how to incorporate accessibility and making sure that the benefits of making any changes to the regulations or zoning ordinances in your communities, making sure the benefits of that work are accessible to everyone who is a member of your community through the EVs for All structure of the program. We did cover the EVs for All structure pretty in depth in our Charging Smart 101 webinar, so I'll link to that recording in the chat in just a couple of moments as well. I do know that this graph we're showing on your screen is far too small to read. That's why I'm going to link back to the first webinar. But I wanted to go ahead and show it to you again here because it gives an overview of EVs for All and the idea that there is a lot of flexibility incorporated into it, and it's very adaptable to whatever your situation is. Because we want to highlight the importance of considering access for all members of your community, regardless of the action you're taking or the type of community members you're working with. So what does this mean for regulation? In terms of the regulation category, I would focus on the top part of the EVs for All graphic you're seeing on your screen that's in the color green. It looks at actions from the framework that involve the creation of documents or items that are kind of static or updated and revised on long timescales, which is perfect for the regulations category or your zoning ordinance updates. One example of a way to earn EVs for All points is to make a statement acknowledging that you have disadvantaged members of your communities or folks who may have a hard time benefiting from changes you're making around transportation electrification in your regulations or your zoning ordinances. And that type of initiative on your part could earn 5 EVs for All points. It's a really great way to get started. If you want to take it a step further, say you're working through the memo that I talked about earlier that explores your zoning ordinances and finds any barriers, maybe you could go one step further and make a plan by identifying specific actions you could take to remove those barriers. For example, perhaps you want to update your zoning ordinance to make requirements for electric charging in multifamily housing that has a high portion of low to moderate income individuals. Identifying that kind of specific and tangible step in that memo would be an even better type of EVs for All action and earn 10 points. If you even make a formal commitment to doing that tangible action, to making requirements in your zoning ordinance for those chargers in multifamily housing by a set day or by a set period of your zoning update process, that is really a fantastic initiative in terms of both impact and effort that you're demonstrating to your community members, and that would be worth 15 EVs for All points. And if you take it one step farther and actually report after you complete your memo on barriers that now identifies the issue, makes a plan to address it, and makes a formal commitment to taking action, and you come back and tell us later, we have done an action as a result of that work, that is amazing. And it would be worth 20 EVs for all points, which can go to your overall EVs for all points requirements for all levels of designation in the Charging Smart program. So I know that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of how the EVs for All program works. But again, I will drop a couple of additional resources in the chat, and our team is happy to talk about these things in more depth at any point in your participation in Charging Smart. So please feel free to put any questions in today in our Q&A, or reach out to us afterwards for a one-on-one meeting. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Ed Gilliland, who again is a leader at IREC, leading their work on Charging Smart. Ed, it is a pleasure to have you here. I know you have extensive expertise in this topic, so I'm really grateful that you take the time to speak with us and present at this webinar. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, thank you, Mackenzie. And if you want, I can, if I can share my screen. I think you have to. Okay. Okay, hopefully this is visible to everybody. And
Looks good,
great. So good morning, and also happy Halloween. And please, if you have some Reese's peanut butter cups, pass them my way. I think great. So yes, so Ed Gilliland, I'm a senior director with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, and I lead the our national Charging Smart program. And so IREC, we are, again, like Great Plains, we're a nonprofit focused on the rapid adoption of clean energy to benefit the people, the economy, and the planet. And we've got some, we have 3 areas: workforce development, local initiatives, and regulatory engagement. And the Charging Smart program is part of our local initiatives effort. I will move on. We are, and I don't know if you're, of course, I know we've been talking about Charging Smart, but just to let you know that Charging Smart is now, it's a DOE funded program, and it's part of a suite of programs, which we call, the umbrella brand is Energy Ready. And so that also includes Soul Smart, and then a program that's about to be launched called Distributed Wind Smart. So we're happy, we're working with Great Plains on all of these programs, and so happy to make connections on other ones if you are interested. But today we're talking about EV charging, and that relates to our Charging Smart program. Okay, so we're going to talk about planning and zoning, planning documents, zoning and use designation, and parking. Certainly, you know, what is the challenge out there if you are a company that you want to install charging equipment? You often, of course, you have to deal with multiple jurisdictions around the country that all have different ways of permitting and approving your applications for charging. So it's quite a challenge for the charging companies. It's also a new topic for many local officials. So you're not expected, you know, you didn't learn about EV charging through all your life, because it is something that is kind of new on the scenes in the last few years. And given all of that, it can take a long time to permit charging, sometimes even up to 6 months. This is the challenge that we're up against now. And so the idea is, let's come up with some approaches that would seem to work as much as we can around the country. And so we looked at, you know, several years ago, we were faced with a lot of these issues. And so as part of and I'm going to throw out a lot of names here that are not that relevant, maybe to you, but just for attribution purposes, we at IREC, we oversee what's called the Sustainable Energy Action Committee that's funded by Department of Energy. And it has working groups that work on all sorts of permitting issues related to solar, battery storage, EV charging. And so this group has a electric vehicle charging working group. It's one of their 10 working groups. And they formed a subcommittee on planning, zoning, and permitting. So going there, that's where we set up a multidisciplinary team of all stakeholders from both industry, planning departments, nonprofits. Great Plains was part of this. So we had a big team put together and went through a year-long process to try to address these issues particularly in the planning and zoning realm. And of course, the purpose is to provide really predictable and transparent local standards that can help us with permitting EV charging, and really in a non-single family or non-residential capacity, because we know that single family charging permitting has not been that much of a challenge, at least it is what we're hearing. But when we get up to multifamily, and including multifamily and commercial, but we have multifamily and workplace and retail, then charging becomes more of a challenge on the permitting side of things. So, I'm going to step back and so we worked along this, and we also worked closely with RMI. And so this report, this guidance document, was really developed a collaboration between IREC and RMI under the SEAC stakeholder working groups. And so we look here and we see that there are a lot of things that affect the ability of a locality to be prepared for electric vehicles and deploy EV charging. There's all these blue things on the left that you guys are familiar with. You can do education and outreach and incentives and have clean fleets. And then we look over at the green on the right. We have sort of the utility side of things, which is also very important and can be a significant barrier. And so we need to be able to connect the charging load, the load that we create, to the grid. And there are a host of issues related to that. So what we're talking about today is in the middle, this local regulatory approval. And specifically, we're going to look at these orange boxes. Now, the reason is that when we talk to the electric vehicle service providers, the charging companies that do the installations, they informed us that the planning and zoning reviews pose a greater barrier to getting approval to install chargers than does the sort of technical codes like the building and electrical codes. Now, that doesn't mean that projects don't get hung up with in complying to the codes, and happy to but in this case, what we're hearing is that the planning and zoning is a real issue. And so we look at really two things. One is the documents themselves. So these are, of course, what the locality has to deal with: their planning, comp plan, their zoning ordinances. And so those are sort of the set documents, and then the approval process itself. So how does it go from one department to another, or is there sequential department reviews or concurrent reviews? So there's a whole host of things just on the process itself. So those are really what we looked at in this guidance, planning zoning guide, developing this document. And here is the table of contents, and the meat of this guidance is in the regulatory requirements, which shows you over in the yellow. So the things we looked at: the planning documents, the zoning, parking, and admittedly a lot of parking is part of zoning, but it seemed to be such a major issue that we carved it out as its own sort of subcategory, and it even has subcategories to that, such as the parking count, the accessibility, and the EV charger readiness, which deals with EV capable, EV ready ordinances. Then there's design, aesthetics, equipment location. We also included a section on on-street charging because that seemed to be such an important issue for local governments. So we're going to, this is our document. And again, this is the section on the regulatory requirements. You can see down here, we also have a section on the approval process, the application process and review. So today I'm going to focus on part of this document, the planning, zoning, and we will talk about the first subsection under parking. So yeah, here's what the things we're going to cover today: planning, zoning, and the parking counts. So planning documents is the first thing we want to talk about. And note that planning really matters. Of course, as a local government, a lot of the more granular parts of regulation are looked to the broader planning documents as a guide in how to regulate. So it is so important that you have a comprehensive plan and supporting plans such as the climate action plans and transportation plans that do address EV charging. And generally, these do not have to be detailed, but it's important to address it and lay out how the community wants to proceed with EVs and EV charging. And this can then guide these more granular documents, such as the zoning ordinance. In developing the plan, it is important to collaborate with the regional planning organizations. They are, particularly if you're a smaller community, they can be very helpful in providing guidance and helping you align with what's going on in the region for charging. And then it's important to collaborate with the utilities because they are going to need to have to provide the power, and this can be a barrier or a bottleneck to development of EV charging. And so the utility collaboration is very important. And anytime you hear a talk about when you talk to the utilities, the answer is early and often. So great to keep these two groups, and particularly in the forefront of the planning efforts. We would suggest that you want to inventory existing and proposed locations and project EV charger demand by use case. So how do you do that? Well, we actually have a partner on the Charging Smart team, RMI, who was helped in preparing this guidance, that also has developed a modeling tool where you can, in fact, project EV charger demand by use case and by sub area. So if you are interested in that, I would check with McKinsey and see about arranging for a meeting with RMI, and they can go over that program. Makes it important to certainly consider the residents, all of us who lack access to off-street parking. So even though we're looking at demand by use case, we want to recognize that disadvantaged areas may not appear to have much demand now, but we want to prepare and help facilitate their access to charging, and as we all can benefit from the movement to electric vehicles. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the zoning and use designation, and particularly we'll talk about the code, addressing it in the code, accessory use, discretionary reviews, and primary use. So first, and I think that's apparent by looking at the chat, that many of you are looking at changing your code or refining the code to address EV charging. But certainly the first basic lesson here is make sure that charging is addressed in the zoning code. If it is not, then invariably what happens is an application comes in for a charging station, and the regulatory process gets bogged down because they're not sure what to do. It takes a long time. You might go through even a public hearing or zoning commission review. And this takes a lot of time on behalf of the locality. So by addressing this in the zoning code, it helps identify what the locality expects in a charging application. And you also want to include in the zoning code the administration and procedure part of charging. So how is it handled by the locality? What constitutes certain levels of review? And this clarity gives a certainty to the installer of what to expect, and therefore more likely to have a smoother process on both the installer side and on the local government's side. McKinsey talked about one of the silver requirements, and this is how do you deal with accessory use? So obviously, if you have accessory use, EV charging would occur in say a multifamily housing, a retail shopping center, a workplace where charging is only a subordinate use to the main use of the property. And typically, in the profession, an accessory use gets a lower level of regulatory review because it has less impact on the subject property that's being changed or modified and surrounding property. So we would suggest that, say that accessory use should be allowed by right in all zones, and it can be reviewed administratively and not need to go to any kind of zoning or planning commission or city council reviews to put in charging. So to get a little more into the details on this, we want to back up and look at something called a conditional use. And this is typically you see conditional use or conditional use permit required for a development that is allowed in an area, but it still has conditions. So example, churches in a residential area, they're allowed, but you still have to go through a conditional use process and get a permit because the neighbors may want to have a say in whether the church is allowed or not. So gasoline stations are often subject to a conditional use permit, and it then therefore sets up the stage for public hearings, zoning commission, planning commission, city council approval. It can be very time consuming, and so we want to avoid that at all possible for EV charging. So a similar situation is a site plan review. So anytime you have a development that is fairly impactful, such as you're putting in a shopping center or an apartment complex, it's going to go through site plan review to make sure it is in harmony with existing surroundings. And again, you would expect there would be public hearings and zoning and planning commission review, and it should take time. So we understand this process, and if you are if you are building a shopping center, it should go through this level of scrutiny. But we would certainly suggest this be avoided for EV charging. There is a workaround. So sometimes we've seen cities where they say, well, if you're going to put in more than 10 chargers, then you're subject to a site plan review. Well, okay, you could still do that, but set it up as a minor site plan review process that can be approved administratively. So there are other ways to address that, but it allows you to take a closer look at it. Maybe you want to look at some of the traffic patterns to make sure that the project, the development will be in line or in harmony with the surroundings. Of course, there are going to be times when charging is not an accessory use, but is actually a primary use. So if you put in a charging hub, then it is a primary use, and typically a primary use would go through a site plan review. And we would suggest here, and it could go through a considerable amount of scrutiny. So we would suggest here that as Mackenzie said earlier in one of the, is to define charging as its own use, not as a traditional fueling station. Fueling stations are subject to more heavy environmental review. You're dealing with underground storage tanks. There's a lot of issues involved, and we would not want EV charging, even as a primary use, to get the same level of scrutiny, and rather define it as its own use. And so, again, this would and allow it to be approved in commercial zones, all commercial zones. And if you go through this process, then hopefully we can avoid the discretionary reviews we just discussed. So summary, address it in the code. Allow accessory use EV charging by right in all zones. When clearly a primary use, allow it as an approved use. So we can help avoid the discretionary reviews. And all of this probably might mean an update to the zoning code or a zoning amendment. I will take just a minute to talk about parking count, because that is another important area that, and you saw Mackenzie brought that up in that's this requirement for the silver designation. And so we do see many localities, they set minimum parking requirements. Of course, the trend is to reduce those requirements to encourage more travel by transit or bike. And so, but you would not want to then say, okay, you're going to take an existing parking space, you're going to convert it to dedicated EV charging, and then it might be subject to a violation of the minimum parking requirements, and that's what we want to avoid. So we suggest that existing spaces count towards the minimum parking requirements. So if you have a minimum requirement for 40 spaces for a certain development, and they're going to convert 5 of those to EV charging spaces, they're still parking spaces. And so we would suggest that that's still 40 spaces and it meets the minimum requirements. However, there are other issues to consider here. Accessible charging spaces are going to take up more space than your standard parking space. So we would suggest that they be allowed to count as 2 parking spaces for determining minimum parking requirements. Likewise, there are going to be occasions where particularly if there are setback restrictions, where there's going to be need for electric vehicle related equipment. And we suggest that if it has to take up parking spaces, that also not violate the minimum parking requirements. Okay. So that is the discussion. If you want to look at the planning and zoning guidance, here is the website link. It has an executive summary, and then you can download the whole document. So I will stop there and happy to take questions from you guys.
Thank you, Ed. That was a really helpful presentation. I will be watching the chat box to relay questions to you. So folks, feel free to, just come off mute or raise your virtual hand, or drop questions in the chat for Ed. or the GPI team about regulations and zoning, or the charging smart requirements that are kind of around them. So, Ed, in the meantime, while we're waiting for some questions to come in here, when folks are addressing some of these regulation activities, what do you think has been the most beneficial thing you've seen communities get started with first? Are they looking at zoning ordinances in general, or are they looking for specific things like parking minimums that we flagged here, some other specific topics, and taking care of those specific items in a discrete manner? What's the fastest way to get started?
Sure. So often, and when you do, if you do like for the bronze requirement, you do the research into your zoning code, identify what the intentional and unintentional barriers are. You'll be looking for these topics to be covered in the code. Now, if they are not, it may take a quick review. If they're not, then the suggestion is to start thinking about, can we do a zoning amendment, and can we incorporate accessory use by right, the parking minimums, not violating parking minimums. Can we incorporate these in a zoning amendment? How much, of course, you have your own local politics or local issues. Are they willing to accept a pretty an amendment that incorporates a lot of everything we've talked about, or maybe it's a few things, but probably the ones for silver, the accessory use by right and parking minimum standards would be 1, 2 I'd put at the top of the list. The other thing is you would want to look at in similar codes, which we could maybe provide some, what is this other communities done that that the code language, and so you can point to other code language that other communities have done that have made similar types of enacted similar types of code amendments.
Thank you, Ed. And I think your last point there is something I want to highlight a little further. That's one thing we think is really beneficial about having these kind of cohort-based webinars and gathering opportunities is there are folks on this call or folks who are participating in the cohort and just weren't able to make it today who probably have a pretty similar composition of their leaders or community context, and so they have maybe navigated a process that you're just getting started on already, and they might have, as Ed mentioned, some language for a zoning ordinance update or something else. Maybe it's just how do you write the memo to get the conversation started, and what worked with your leaders to get it on the docket. So I would encourage you to think about reaching out to other folks that are here today, or if you don't know, maybe which communities have tried this, the GPI team should know. We can make those connections to you, but it's really helpful to have a peer community that faces similar situations that you can look to and kind of get that camaraderie from. We do have a question for you, Ed, in the chat from Max at Coon Rapids, who says, are there any ADA regulations around accessible EV charging stations? This is something I hadn't thought about addressing before.
So there are national design guidelines. And that is in the I think it's the U.S. Access Board. I think it's in our planning and zoning guidance. So if you want to, yes, somebody, Rebecca, put that in there. So if you want to, so that's a good place to start, because and it's very comprehensive. It is also what it's consistent with what they're trying to do with the NEVI funding. So that's a good place to start. The other, what it doesn't do necessarily is tell you what number of ADA spaces you want to have or should have for a given development. So one of the other places we talk about in the planning and zoning guidance is we look at states and see where that's been done. In this case, California has developed numbers of ADA spaces for a given number of parking spaces. So if you have less than 20 spaces that you're doing EV charging, then maybe only one of those has to be ADA compliant. If you have 50 spaces, perhaps 2 or 3. So they have set up those numbers, requirements for development in California. And so if you want to look at an example there, that is in the guidance document, detail in the guidance document.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ed. And if you need access to any of that guidance that Ed is mentioning, of course, we'd be happy to connect you with it. And we do have another question in from Noel at Roseville. Are there any standards emerging for the, number or percentage of stalls that have to be EV SE or EV ready? And I think that's going to be probably a similar answer to what you said about the numbers and percentages of ADA access. But do you have any additional thoughts there, Ed?
Sure. So the percentage of, so this is looking at new construction and often at major renovations. And the idea is that the locality is going to say that we want you to prepare a certain percentage of the spaces so that they can accept EV charging after they get built without going back and doing very costly trenching and things that would really discourage the development of charging. So the idea is to make them ready, put in the electrical conduits, maybe put in the wiring, and then later on, somebody can just go and put in and install a charger, and it's all ready to go. So the percentage requirements have been increasing over the years. I would say typically what we were seeing 4 or 5 years ago was, maybe 5 or 10% of multifamily be EV capable or EV ready, and similar for commercial. And now we're seeing in some places doing 20, 40, or 50% for multifamily, maybe 20 or 30% for commercial. So those percentages are increasing. And yes, Mackenzie, we do reference that in the guidance document where we talk about what the percentages they have in California, which are pretty aggressive percentages, and other cities around the country, such as Denver and Portland and places like that, which have taken on fairly aggressive percentages that need to be EV capable or EV ready. I will say that in California and around the country, there's a growing emphasis on especially adding more and more multifamily housing being EV capable or EV ready. And one of the arguments here is it's an equity argument in that if you build or renovate multifamily and do not put many charging or make many spaces ready for charging, then potentially you're eliminating a certain part of the population from being able to enjoy the benefits of electric vehicle charging.
Great, thank you, Ed. And just to add on for Noel's question, there are some criteria in the Charging Smart framework in the regulation category that also address the percentages. So these can still be context specific. These are not requirements. They're just criteria that you can use to satisfy some of the Charging Smart needs for the designation levels. But for example, our 2.4 talks about requiring 40% of multifamily parking to be EV capable, ready, or installed. And that would be worth 5 points in the regulation category. So there are some opportunities there for some guidance. And I want to highlight that we also had different actions around commercial buildings. So it's important to think about the specific zones that you might be operating in. So folks, please continue to add your questions. We have just a few more minutes here, maybe time for one or two. But Ed, I'll take the prerogatory to ask you a question here, if you don't mind. I know you talked about a couple of things that are really beneficial to encouraging charging infrastructure, like making them a use by right, and how to consider them as a primary use case. But when we're talking with folks about doing this memo, looking over their zoning requirements, we ask them to focus on things that restrict the installation of those chargers. But is there anything beyond what you've already mentioned that you've seen to be really beneficial in any context? I know you have a lot of experience across the country, so just wanted to pick your brain there. Anything that's just wonderful.
So, what we are seeing, I think, and this is, again, we try to incorporate the things into the designation criteria. So we spent a lot of time today talking about what it takes, the regulations related to silver. And then the one in the gold, where we're then asking the community to commit to be able to turn around a charging permit in a certain amount of time. We don't say what that time has to be. But the idea is the community sits down and says, okay, we can make this process efficient, and we're going to commit to a time that we believe is that we're going to adhere to. And then along with that, when an application is reviewed, and ideally it is reviewed by departments concurrently and not sequentially. Therefore, it's going to be a quicker process. But still, at the end of that review, all of the comments are put together and given back to the applicant. So if there are issues or concerns, they're all there, just like you took a test and you got their paper back and it said, these are the, you got a B, but you got, these 4 things that need to be addressed. You want to do that and not give them partial, here are some things that need to be addressed. And then a week later, come back with 2 more things, and a week later come back with one more thing. So we really want to give a good comprehensive feedback, so then the applicant can take that and address the issues, and then once they've done that, they should be ready to go.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I think that concurrent piece really builds on the idea of consolidating the feedback in the permitting process. Thank you for highlighting that. I think we have just a few minutes left here, so if we could return to the slides, I do have a couple of follow-up actions I wanted to highlight for you all. So if your community is new to charging smart, and I should say, I'm remiss, let me just one more time say thank you to Ed. That was very, very helpful to have that overview of the report and of all of the guidance that you're able to share on regulations and zoning. I really appreciate you being here today. With that said, if your community is new to charging smart, we might have some folks joining us for the first time today. The next step is to complete your self-assessment and a commitment letter to participating in the program. We do have a link to the self-assessment and can provide it in a Word document format if you'd like to see all those questions at once. To coordinate your responses. And we have a template for the commitment letter. So if you need either one of those resources, please let the GPI team know. You can put in the chat right now and we'll get it to you as soon as possible. The next step for new communities or anyone else on this call is to schedule a one-on-one goal setting meeting with GPI. And at that time, we will have looked through your self-assessment and we'll be able to help make recommendations on all actions from the categories of the Charging Smart program. But since we're talking about regulations today, we can help you think through how to achieve the required regulation criteria, or if you want to select additional criteria from the Charging Smart guidance, we can help you pick and navigate what makes sense for your context if you want that kind of guidance. Beyond that, we encourage you to always be keeping an eye out for relevant funding opportunities for installing chargers and also for fleet expansion and shared mobility opportunities, anything relevant to transportation electrification. And you can let us know if you need support with that or anything else in your electrification journey at any point. I think on the next slide, we just have a couple more resources for you, including the Charging Smart website, a guidebook that we have around ordinance consideration, and a template for the EV charger permitting checklist that has been mentioned as a requirement to achieving designation. So we have resources available to you, and I also dropped links to 2 different webinars into the chat. One was titled Charging Smart 101, in which we drill down into the EVs for All component of the program that is relevant to regulation and every other category. And then the second webinar linked to is about critical early actions that highlight some of the regulation activities that might have a bit of a longer lead time and provide some tips on how to get started with those. So a lot of resources and are available, but if you have any questions about which ones make sense or you just want to talk through it, we're always happy to have a one-on-one meeting or an email chain at any time. That is it from the GPI team. So I will close this out today by saying thank you again to all of you for being here on the webinar today, and encouraging you to reach out to us or to each other to continue the great work that you're already doing. We're here to support you in any way that we can. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I hope that at least some of you get some Reese's peanut butter cups and enjoy the rest of your Halloween. Thank you, everybody.